Chapter 5. O tongue, give sound to joy and sing of hope and promise on dragon wing. No one, as usual, noticed Manoli when she got back to the hold. Dutifully, she saw the harbor master and told him about the tides. "Don't you go so far, girl," he told her kindly. "Thread's due any day now, you know. How's the hand?" She mumbled something, which he didn't hear anyway, as a shipmaster shouted for his attention. The evening meal was hurried since all the masters were going off to the dock cavern to check tide, mast, and ships. In the bustle, Manoli could keep to herself. And she did, seeking the cubicle and the safety of her bed as soon as possible. There she hugged to herself the incredible experience of the morning. She was certain that the queen had understood her. Just like the dragons, fire lizards knew what was in the mind and heart of a person. That's why they disappeared so easily when boys tried to trap them. They'd liked her singing, too. Manoli gave herself a squeeze, ignoring the spasm of pain in her now stiff hand. Then she tensed, remembering that the Brontes had been waiting to see what the queen would do. She was the clever one, the audacious one. What was it Paterian was always quoting? Necessity breeds solution. Did fire lizards really understand people even when they kept away from them then? Manoli puzzled again. Of course, dragons understood what their riders were thinking, but dragons impressed at hatching to their riders. The link was never broken, and the dragon would only hear that one person, or so Paterian had said. So how had the little queen understood her? Necessity? Poor queen. She must have been frantic when she realized that the tide was going to cover her eggs. Probably she'd been depositing her clutches in that cove for who knows how long. How long did fire lizards live? Dragons lasted the life of their rider. Sometimes that wasn't so long now that thread was dropping. Quite a few riders had been so badly scored they'd died, and so had their dragons. Would the little fire lizards have a longer life, being smaller and not in so much danger? Questions darted through Manoli's mind, like fire lizards flashing, she thought, as she cuddled into the warmth of her sleeping fur. She'd try to go back tomorrow, maybe with food. She rather thought fire lizards would like spider claws, too, and maybe then she'd get the queen's trust. Or maybe it would be better if she didn't go back tomorrow. She should stay away for a few days. Then, too, with thread falling so often, it was dangerous to go so far from the safety of the hold. What would happen when the fire lizard eggs hatched? What a sight that would be. All the lads in the sea hold talking about catching fire lizards, and she, Manoli, had not only seen but talked to them and handled their eggs. And if she were lucky, she might even get to see them hatching, too. Why, that would be as marvelous as going to a dragon hatching at one of the weirs, and no one, not even Yanis, had been to a hatching. Considering her exciting thoughts, it was a wonder that Manoli was able to sleep. The next morning her hand ached and throbbed, and she was stiff from the fall and the climbing. Her half-formed notion of going back to the Dragonstone's cove was thwarted by the weather, of all things. A storm had blown in from the sea that night, lashing the harbor with pounding waves. Even the dock cavern waters were turbulent, and a wind whipped with such whimsical force that walking from hold to cavern was dangerous. The men gathered in the great hall in the morning, mending gear and yarning. Mavi organized her women for an exhaustive cleaning of some of the inner hold rooms. Manoli and Sella were sent down to the glow storage so often that Sella vowed she didn't need light to show her the way anymore. Manoli worked willingly enough, checking glows in every single room in the hold. It was better to work than to think. That evening she couldn't escape the great hall. Since everyone had been in all day, everyone needed entertainment and was going. The harper would surely play. Manoli shuddered. Well, there was no help for it. She had to hear music sometime. She couldn't avoid it forever. And at least she could sing along with the others. But she soon found she couldn't even have that pleasure. Mavi gestured to her when the harper began to tune his guitar, and when the harper beckoned for everyone to join in the choruses, Mavi pinched Manoli so hard that she gasped. "Don't roar. You may sing softly as befits a girl your age," Mavi said, "or don't sing at all." Across the hall, Sella was singing, not at all accurately and loud enough to be heard in bend and hold, but when Manoli opened her mouth to protest, she got another pinch. So she didn't sing at all. but sat there by her mother's side, numb and hurt, not even able to enjoy the music and very conscious that her mother was being monstrously unfair. Wasn't it bad enough she couldn't play anymore yet, but not to be allowed to sing? Why, everyone had encouraged her to sing when old Peterian had been alive, and been glad to hear her, asked her to sing time and again. Then Manoli saw her father watching her, his face stern, one hand tapping not so much to the time of the music, but to some inner agitation. It was her father who didn't want her to sing. It wasn't fair. It just wasn't fair. Obviously, they knew and were glad she hadn't come before. They didn't want her here. She wrenched herself free from her mother's grip, and ignoring Mavy's hiss to come back and behave herself, she crept from the hall. Those who saw her leave thought sadly that it was such a pity she'd hurt her hand, and didn't even want to sing any more. Wanted or not, creeping out like that would send Mavy looking for her when there was a pause in the evening singing. So Manoli took her sleeping furs and a glow and went to one of the unused inner rooms where no one would find her. She brought her clothes, too. If the storm cleared, she'd be away in the morning to the fire lizards. They liked her singing. They liked her. Before anyone else was up, she had risen. She gulped down a cold claw and ate some bread, stuffed more in her pouch, and was almost away. Her heart beat fast while she struggled with the big metal doors of the hold entrance. She'd never opened them before and hadn't appreciated how very solid they were. She couldn't, of course, bar them again, but there was scarcely any need. Sea mist was curling up from the quiet harbor waters, the entrances to the dock cavern visible as darker masses in the gray, but the sun was beginning to burn through the fog, and Manoli's weather sense told her that it would soon be clear. As she strode down the broad holdway, mist swirled up and away from her steps. It pleased Manoli to see something give way before her, even something as nebulous as fog. Visibility was limited, but she knew her path by the shape of the stones along the road, and was soon climbing through the caressing mists to the bluff. She struck somewhat inland toward the first of the marshes. 1 cup of claw and a hunk of bread was not enough food, and she remembered some unstripped marshberry bushes. She was over the first humpy hill, and suddenly the mist had left the land, and the brightness of the spring sun almost an ache to the eyes. She found her patch of marshberries and picked 1 handful for her face, then 1 for the pouch. Now that she could see where she was going, she jogged down the coast and finally dropped into a cove. The tide was just right to catch spider claws. These should be a pleasant offering to the fire lizard queen, she thought as she filled her bag. Or could fire lizards hunt in fog? When Manoli had carried her loaded sack through several long valleys and over humpy hills, she was beginning to wish she'd waited a while to do her netting. She was hot and tired. Now that the excitement of her unorthodox behavior had waned, she was also depressed. Of course, it was quite likely that no one had noticed she'd left. No one would realize it was she who had left the hold doors unbarred, a terrible offense against the hold safety rules. Manoli wasn't sure why, because who'd want to enter the sea hold unless he had business there? Come all that dangerous way across the marshes? For what? There were quite a few precautions scrupulously observed in the sea hold that didn't make much sense to Manoli, like the hold doors being barred every night, and unshielded glows never being left in an unused room, although it was all right in corridors. Glows wouldn't burn anything, and think of all the barked shins that would be saved by leaving a few room glows unshielded. No one was likely to notice that she was gone until there was some unpleasant or tedious job for a one-handed girl to do, so they wouldn't assume that she'd open the hold door. And since Manoli was apt to disappear during the day, no one would think anything about her until evening. Then someone might just wonder where Manoli was. That was when she realized that she didn't plan to return to the hold. And the sheer audacity of that thought was enough to make her halt in her tracks. Not return to the hold. Not go back to the endless round of tedious tasks, of gutting and smoking, salting, pickling fish, mending nets, sails, and cloths, cleaning dishes, clothes, rooms, gathering greens, berries, grasses, spider claws. Not return to tend old uncles and aunts, fires, pots, looms, glow baskets? To be able to sing, or shout, or roar, or play, if she so chose? To sleep? Now, where would she sleep? And where would she go when there was threat in the skies? Manoli trudged on more slowly up the sand dunes, her mind churning with these revolutionary ideas. Why, everyone had to return to the hold at night. The hold, any hold, or cot or weir. 7 turns had thread been dropping from the skies, and no one traveled far from shelter. She remembered vaguely from her childhood that there used to be caravans of traders coming through the marshlands in the spring, in the summer, and early fall. There'd been gay times with lots of singing and feasting. The hold doors had not been barred then. She sighed. Those had been happier times. The good old days that old uncle and the aunties were always droning on about. But once thread started falling, everything had changed for the worse. At least that was the overall impression she had from the adults in the hold. Some stillness in the air, some vague unease caused Manoli to glance about her apprehensively. There was certainly no one else about at this early hour. She scanned the skies. The mist banking the coast was rapidly dispersing. She could see it retreating across the water to the north and west.
It's thread time.
Toward the east, the sky was brilliant with sunrise, except for what were probably some traces of early morning fog in the northeast. Yet something disturbed Manoli. She felt she should know what it was.
It's thread time.
You think?
It's thread time.
She was nearly to the Dragonstones now, in the last marsh before the contour of the land swept gently up toward the seaside bluff. It was as she traversed the marsh that she identified the odd quality. It was the stillness. Not of wind, for that was steadily seaward, blowing away the fog, but a stillness of marsh life. All the little insects and flies and small wrigglers, the occasional flights of wild wherries who nestled in the heavier bushes, were silent. Their myriad activities and small noises began as soon as the sun was up and didn't cease until just before dawn, because the nocturnal insects were as noisy as the daytime ones. It was this quiet, as if every living thing was holding its breath, that was disturbing Manoli. Unconsciously, she began to walk faster, and she had a strong urge to glance over her right shoulder toward the northeast, where a smudge of gray clouded the horizon. A smudge of gray? Or silver? Manoli began to tremble with rising fear and the dawning knowledge that she was too far from the safety of the hold to reach it before thread reached her. The heavy metal doors, which she had so negligently left ajar, would soon be closed and barred against her and thread. And even if she were missed, no one would come for her. She began to run, and some instinct directed her toward the cliff edge before she consciously remembered the Queen's Ledge. It wasn't big enough, really. Or she could go into the sea. Thread drowned in the sea. So would she, for she couldn't keep under the water for the time it would take Thread to pass. How long would it take the leading edge of a fall to pass over? She'd no idea. She was at the edge now, looking down at the beach. She could see her ledge off to the right. There was the lip of the cliff that had broken off under her weight. That was the quick way down, to be sure, but she couldn't risk it again and didn't want to. She glanced over her shoulder. The grayness was spreading across the horizon. Now she could see flashes against that gray. Flashes? Dragons! She was seeing dragons fighting Thread, their fiery breath charring the dreaded stuff midair. They were so far away that the winking lights were more like lost stars than dragons fighting for the life of Pern. Maybe the leading edge wouldn't reach this far? Maybe she was safe. Maybes seldom are, as her mother would say. In the stillness of the air, a new sound made itself heard, a soft, rhythmic thrumming, something like the tuneless humming of small children, only different. The noise seemed to come from the ground. She dropped, pressed one ear to a patch of bare stone. The sound was coming from within. Of course! The bluff was hollow. That's why the queen lizard... On her hands and knees, Manoli scooted to the cliff edge, looking for that halfway ledge out of the queen's. Manoli had enlarged the entry once. There was every chance she could make it big enough to squirm through. The little queen would certainly be hospitable to someone who had saved her clutch. And Manoli didn't come empty-handed as a guest. She swung the heavy sack of spider claws around to her back. Grabbing handfuls of the grasses on the lip of the cliff, she began to let herself slowly down. Her feet fumbled for support. She found one toehold and dug half that foot in, the other foot prodding for another place. She slithered badly once, but a rock protrusion caught her in the crotch before she'd slipped far. She laid her face against the cliff, gulping to get back her breath and courage. She could feel the thrumming through the stone, and oddly that gave her heart. There was something intensely exciting and stimulating about that sound. Sheer luck guided her foot to the queen's ledge. She'd risked only a few glances beneath her. The aspect was almost enough to make her lose her balance completely. She was trembling so much with her exertions that she had to rest then. Definitely the humming came from the queen's cavern. She could get her head into the original opening. No more. She began to tear at the sides with her bare hands until she thought of her belt knife. The blade loosened a whole section all at once, showering her with sand and bits of rock. She had to clean her eyes and mouth of grit before she could continue. Then she realized she'd gotten to sheer rock. She could get herself into the shelter only up to her shoulders. No matter how she turned and twisted, there was an outcropping that she could not pass. Once again she wished she were as small as a girl ought to be. Sella would have had no trouble crawling through that hole. Resolutely, Manoli began to chip at the rock with her knife, the blows jarring her hand to the shoulder and making no impression at all on the rock. She wondered frantically how long it had taken her to get down the cliff. How long did she have before Thread would be raining down on her unprotected body? Body? She might not get past the bobble in the wall with her shoulders, but she reversed her position, and feet, legs, hips, all right up to the shoulders, passed into the safety of solid rock. Her head was covered, but only just by the cliff overhang. Did Thread see where it was going when it fell? Would it notice her crowded into this hole as it flashed by? Then she saw the thong of the carry sack where she'd looped it over the ledge to keep it handy, but out of the way. If Thread got into the spider claws... She pulled herself far enough out of the hole to cast an eye above. No silver yet. No sound but the steadily increasing thrumming. That wouldn't have anything to do with Thread, would it? The carry sack thong had bitten into the ledge, and she had a job of freeing it, having to yank rather hard. The next thing she knew, the sack came free. The force of her pull threw her backwards, cracking her head on the roof of her tunnel, and then the surface beneath her buttocks started to slide, down and out. Manoli clawed her way into the tunnel as the ledge slowly detached itself from the face of the cliff and tumbled down onto the beach. Manoli scrambled back quickly, afraid more of the entrance would go, and suddenly she was in a cave. Wide, high, deep, clutching the carry sack and staring at the greatly widened mouth. The thrumming was behind her, and startled at what she could only consider an additional threat, she whirled. Fire lizards were perched around the walls, clinging to rock spur and ledge. Every eye glinted at the mound of eggs in the sandy center of the cave. The thrumming came from the throats of all the little fire lizards, and they were far too intent on what was happening to the eggs to give any heed to her abrupt appearance. Just as Manoli realized that she was witnessing a hatching, the first egg began to rock, and cracks appeared in its shell. It rocked itself off the mound of the clutch.
Can I have the rest of your egg? No.
And, in hitting the ground, split. From the two parts emerged a tiny creature, not much bigger than Manoli's hand, glistening brown and creeling with hunger, swaying its head back and forth and tottering forward a few awkward steps. The transparent brown wings unfolded, flapping weakly to dry, and the creature's balance improved. The creel turned to a hiss of displeasure, and the little brown peered about defensively. The other fire lizards crooned, encouraging it to some action. With a tiny shriek of anger, the little brown launched itself toward the cave opening, passing so close to Manoli she could have touched it. The brown fire lizard lurched off the eroded tip of the cave, pumping its wings frantically to achieve flight. Manoli gasped as the creature dropped, and then sighed with relief as it came into sight briefly, airborne, and flew off across the sea. More creeling brought her attention back to the clutch. Other fire lizards had begun to hatch in that brief period, each one shaking its wings and then, encouraged by the weirmates, flopping and weaving toward the cave mouth, defiantly independent and hungry. Several greens and blues, a little bronze, and two more browns hatched and passed Manoli. And then, as she watched a little blue launch itself, Manoli screamed. No sooner had the blue emerged from the safety of the cliff Then she saw the thin, writhing silver of thread descending. In a moment, the blue was covered with the deadly filaments. It uttered one hideous shriek and disappeared. Dead? Or between? Certainly badly scored. 2 more little fire lizards passed Manoli, and she reacted now. No, you can't! You'll be killed! She flung herself across their path. The angry fire lizards pecked at her unprotected face, and while she covered herself, made their escape. She cried aloud when she heard their screams. Don't let them go, she pleaded with the watching fire lizards. You're older, you know about thread. Tell them to stop. She half crawled, half ran to the rock where the golden queen was perched. Tell them not to go. There's thread out there. They're being killed. The queen looked at her, the many-faceted eyes whirling violently. The queen chuckled and chirped at her, and then crooned as yet another fledgling spread its wings and began to totter towards sure death. Please, little queen, do something. Stop them. The thrill of being the witness to a hatching of fire lizards gave way to horror. Dragons had to be protected because they protected Pern. In Manoli's fear and confusion, the little fire lizards were linked to their giant counterparts. She turned to the other lizards now, begging them to do something, at least until the threadfall was over. Desperately, she plunged back to the cave mouth and tried to turn the little fire lizards back with her hands, blocking their progress with her body. She was overwhelmed with pangs of hunger, belly-knotting, gut-twisting hunger. It took her only a moment to realize that the driving force in these fire lizards was that sort of hunger. That was what was sending them senselessly forth. They had to eat. She remembered that dragons had to eat too when they first hatched, fed by the boys they impressed. Manoli wildly grabbed for her carry sack. With one hand, she snatched a fire lizard back from the entrance, and with the other, a spider claw from the sack. The little bronze screeched once and then bit the spider claw behind the eye, neatly killing it. Wings beating, the bronze lifted itself free of Manoli's grasp, and with more strength than Manoli would have thought the newborn creature could possess, flew its prey to a corner and began tearing it apart. Manoli reached out randomly now, and with some surprise, found herself holding the one queen in the clutch. She snagged 2 spider claws from the sack in her other hand and deposited them and the queen in another corner. Finally realizing she couldn't hand feed the whole clutch, she upended the sack, spilling the shellfish out. Newly hatched fire lizards swarmed over and after the spider claws. Manoli caught 2 more lizards before they could reach the cave mouth and put them squarely in the center of their first meal. She was busy trying to make sure that each new fire lizard had a shellfish when she felt something pricking her shoulder. Surprised, she looked up to find the little bronze clinging to her tunic. His round eyes were whirling, and he was still hungry. She gave him an unclaimed spider claw and put him back in his corner. She tossed the little queen another and snared several other spider claws for her specials. Not many more of the newly hatched got out, not with a source of food so nearby. She'd had a fair haul in the sack, but it didn't take long for the hungry fire lizards to devour every last morsel. The poor things were still sounding starved as they creeled about, tipping over claws and body shells, trying to find any scraps overlooked. But they stayed in the cave, and now the older fire lizards joined them, nuzzling or stroking, making affectionate noises. Utterly exhausted, Manoli leaned back against the wall, watching their antics. At least they'd not all died. She glanced apprehensively at the entrance and saw no more writhing links of thread falling past. She peered further. There wasn't even a trace of the menacing gray fog on the horizon. Threadfall must be over. And not a moment too soon. Now she was experiencing hunger thoughts from all the fire lizards, rather overpoweringly, in fact, because she realized how hungry she herself was. The little queen, the old queen, began to hover in the cave, squeaking an imperious command to her followers. Then she darted out, and the old clutch began to follow her. The fledglings, moving awkwardly, made their virgin flight, and within moments the cave was empty of all but Manoli, her torn sack, and a pile of empty spider claw and fire lizard shells. With their exit, some of Manoli's hunger eased, and she remembered the bread she'd tucked in her pocket. Feeling a bit guilty at this belated discovery, she gratefully ate every crumb. Then she made herself a hollow in the sand, pulled the torn carry sack over her shoulders, and went to sleep.
Oh, she might get stuck in